Members, welcome to the first meeting of the Scrutiny Committee for this year. I'd like to thank all the members for putting themselves forward from their authorities, and let's say welcome to your first meeting. In terms of apologies, we have one apology from Councillor Kidd, and at the moment there's one other councillor who's a member who isn't in attendance, which is Councillor Johnson from Doncaster. But we have enough members for a quorum meeting, so I recommend we move to the first substantive item, which is the appointment of a chair for this municipal year. We now have two nominations from the councillors for chair, which is Councillor Huggan and Councillor Johnson. So if I could ask members to vote on, I'll say the name and then we vote for that councillor, and we'll see if we can appoint a councillor chair for this year. So first of all those votes in favour of Councillor Huggan, please. So we can just check. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 if you include. So in that case, there's no point taking a vote because that's more than 50% of the members. So Councillor Huggan, I hereby declare you chair for the year to come. If you'd like to come up to the table, we'll pause the webcast for a moment while we just sort the chairs out.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to move on to item 3 on the agenda, which are any urgent items and announcements, and I believe there are none. Okay, we'll move to agenda item 4, items to be considered in the absence of public and the press, and there are none on the agenda today. And swiftly moving on to item 5 on the agenda, do members have any declaration of interest to make for this meeting pertaining to any items on the agenda? Okay. Item 6, this is swift. Reports from and questions by members. At the moment we've got none, I believe. And do these have to be taken in advance? Just getting a clarity on this.
Members can raise questions if they want on items.
Okay. Do any members have any questions they would like to raise for this meeting? On the that's pertain to items on the agenda. Okay. Give you a second. No. Item 7, questions from members of the public. We have none for this meeting. Okay. And swiftly moving on to item 8, which is minutes of the previous meeting held on 20th of March 2023. Okay. And okay. Any comments on accuracy as to the minutes? Any typos that anybody spotted? Any people not there? No, none. Okay, and we'll move on to the to any matters. We're moving on to the matters. Do we have to take a vote on the minutes?
Well, accept the correct record. No members.
Anybody objecting? Correct record acceptance. Okay, thank you very much. And we're going to move on to now the action log. Okay.
Can I?
Okay.
Tim.
Shall I?
I just think we ought to thank Colin Ross, who chaired the committee for several years, I believe, who's now gone on to even greater things as the Lord Mayor of Sheffield, and important people do it, you know. And we ought to send him thanks and congratulations on his new role.
We'll just make sure that's noted in the minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll make sure that the thanks are sent to Colin for his studious work. Okay, right. We're going to move on now to the to matters arising and review of the action log. We're going to go through. Should we go through item by item? Yeah. On minute number.
Yeah. Yes, councillors. I don't know if you want me to do it or you do it.
Do you want to do it?
I can take.
Yeah, because you've got.
There's a few items that are still marked as ongoing on here. So, Mayoral scrutiny around healthy life expectancy. So that's been raised with the health equality lead. I'm going to schedule that into work plan and we need to have a meeting with members about the work plan for the coming year anyway, which will be arranged as soon as possible for this committee's
What
work.
sort of timescale are we looking at to review these?
To review these or to
Yeah,
the
to
work
go through some of the work plan. Have you got anything?
I don't know if a date.
programmed in for that?
Ellen, is there a date?
Nothing that's been arranged so far, but I'll email you all tomorrow and try and sort that out.
You're going to set up some sort of doodle type poll for this so that we can
We'll
get the best attendance
we'll get the best
possible.
date we can. So an item from the 19th of January this year, item minute number 57, about South Yorkshire Renewal Fund. This will again be on a future agenda. The Corporate Director of Policy or his nominated substitute will attend to present that item. So the next item is on the same item is for the Exec Director, to my left, Gareth Sutton, to provide the committee with regular updates on the renewal fund. I don't know if Gareth, you want to say something now or?
Just to say there's an item on the agenda today where I'll be providing an update on the place plans that have been brought through, and I'll try and weave this together with the presentation I gave you back in January.
Thanks, Gareth. The next item is bus funding, and we have an agenda item today, and Tim Taylor is here to present on that, so we'll come to item.
We will, thank you. Just one point, particularly in respect of the £2 fare cap. So since this meeting, Department for Transport has agreed to extend the bus fare cap at £2 through till the end of October, and then at £2.50 through till end of October 2024. On the basis of that fairly significant extension to the national scheme, we are undertaking market research in October of this year to get an interim report after 12 months of operation. We started our own fare cap early relative to the DFT scheme in November of last year, and then we'll do a final evaluation in October of next year to give us full understanding of the benefits of the scheme once it closes, assuming it closes on time in October of next year.
Sinead?
I just wanted to ask, was there a similar scheme also for younger people with a lower fare, and has that been continued as well?
I suggest if I cover that in my item in terms of bus update, there's passing reference to it in there and some policy choices to be made, but I'll cover that when I get to the agenda item, which is tabled for today, if that's okay.
Are you happy with that?
Sorry.
Thanks, Tim. Could I just ask on that? Obviously, as you said, the Combined Authority started that £2 fare cap a little earlier than was required. Has there been any consideration given to extending that beyond the end of October 23 deadline rather than going up to £2.50?
At this point, not as an isolated activity. We are considering it in respect of the tram, so we currently continue to fund the fare cap on tram, so that's not a national scheme. We are fully expecting DFT to cover the cost of the bus scheme going forward. Principally, I suspect our choice would be more in relation to what we do at the end of that fare cap in October of 2024, and whether we would choose to either extend on bus and or indeed tram. There's clearly implications and associations to decisions around franchising, because under a franchising scheme, we will be choosing to set our own fares anyway at that point. Now, I'm not saying that even if we take that decision, we're likely to be in a place where we are setting fares that soon, because it's it's an implementation period that takes time thereafter. But depending on how big that gap is and what we understand in about 12 months' time from a cost perspective, we can look at those policy options in due course.
Douglas?
So my point was just that there's a couple of matters arising from the actual minutes, which might technically be the previous item. There were a couple of action points, and I just thought it's probably worth covering off whether they were done, hopefully, quickly.
Carry on.
Item 71, Councillor, on the first bus funding update. Yeah. Director of Public Transport Operations to share the impact evaluation report on £2 fares at a future committee meeting. So, Tim.
That's the same action I've just described. As I say, we had planned originally to do that much earlier than I've just described, on the assumption that the fare cap both on tram and on bus was due to end much earlier than it is now planned to do. So we've extended our timescales in terms of our evaluation activity to take that extension into account.
Okay, thanks. Do you mind if you'd circulate the evaluation report? Certainly benefit to those of us who weren't here at the previous meeting.
It's not been done yet. That's why. So it was due to be done when the scheme was due to end, and the scheme was due to end at the end of March of this year. It was extended temporarily through till June, and then DFT have now announced an extension actually for the best part of 20 months, give or take. So we'll produce that interim report in October or thereabouts, certainly before the end of this calendar year. That can come to this committee, and I suggest it does come to this committee. And then we'll have a full evaluation report in October of 2024, which will do the whole scheme for the period of November 22 through to October 24.
Okay, yeah, understood. That makes sense. Thanks.
Can I just ask about the evaluation, because you said October, and with the timings of our meetings here, we have a meeting in September. I think the next meeting after that is December, so that will be sometime afterwards.
We'll bring it to the December meeting. The actual fieldwork's taking place in October of this year, so it'll be ready to produce the outputs of that work to bring to December.
Okay. And if it is going to be done in October, will it be circulated to members of this committee so that they can have some advance notice before? Because if it's going to be done in October, it's going to be 2 months old by the time we see it. If we see it by the time we come to evaluate it, it'd be good if, as the Scrutiny Committee, that we have the opportunity to be able to have good sight of it, so that we know what we're talking about, and that we can feed in some comments as well from individuals of the committee, I would suggest.
So I think we haven't got the precise timetables of completion of the report yet, but on the basis that they'll be reported well in advance of, or produced well in advance of your December meeting, we'll do as you suggest in terms of sharing the draft report to this committee, and then what we'll then do is use the finalised version of that report with your comment to then publish back to this group for the December meeting to consider formally.
I think that'd be a good idea.
Chair, the second action related to item number 72, mayoral scrutiny, and related to the mayor looking at concern raised about delayed correspondence and the offer to attend a future public meeting. I think it's probably something Councillor Bacon raised in respect of a Rotherham meeting, if I remember rightly. So that action was logged for the mayor to look at that concern.
Okay. Any other questions on that particular thing, Douglas? No. Okay.
Members, the next item is item number 10. It's a forward plan. And really, it's just to ask members if there are any questions related to the forward plan.
We'll move on to next part.
Transport data.
Right. So over to you on the update on transport.
Yep, no, thank you, Chair. So I'll take, obviously, that the paper's been read by members. It's probably worth also giving the very latest known position. Clearly, since this paper was produced and published, we've made further progress in regards to preparation and planning for the budget position and decisions that need to be taken in respect of the bus network. So just to give some sense of background, though, to members, just to lead through the process. So members will all be aware, I'm sure, that the bus network's faced some fairly significant and turbulent times over the last 3 or more years as a result, and directly as a consequence of COVID, and what COVID has done and continues to do in some regards to levels of patronage and therefore the commercial viability of bus services across the region. Throughout that COVID directly related period, in terms of national restrictions and such like, central government, DFT, have been providing bus operators with COVID support funded, so this is revenue support, to supplement their commercial income and to allow them to continue to provide services at a level above what would otherwise be commercially viable to maintain across the region. The very nature of that funding has been cyclical and pretty short term, so no more than 3 to 6 months at best in terms of the duration of funding made available to bus operators. That frequent cliff edge and short-term nature of that funding has meant that both the MCA and indeed bus operators more generally have found it very difficult to make any meaningful long-term plans in decisions around the system and around the network. And indeed, in more than one occasion, we found ourselves very close to that cliff edge of the funding coming to an end, only for DFT at the last minute to make a decision on its further extension. What that has meant is we've had to put in place very short-term decisions, continuation of funding, and to try and protect the network as best we can to maintain a level of service at a level which we believe is at least as very minimally acceptable across the region. To try and offset and prevent some of those issues, in autumn of last year, the MCA decided to put and set aside some financial reserves, primarily for two reasons: one, to protect school services, and one, to protect general networks. So those reserves were established. At the point at which they were established, we were planning on the assumption that bus funding from DFT was ending in March of this year. So that funding was planned to be used primarily from the period of April 23 through till July of 23 to supplement the network, implement a significant network reduction of that year at that time, and then have a financially sustainable system thereafter. When we got close to April of this year, DFT have extended the funding firstly through till June of this year, and now more recently a longer term funding extension through till March of 2025. So we now have in place some level of certainty, at least through till March of 25, as to the level of bus support funding that's going to be in the system. We also, because of the further extensions that DFT have put in place, we've not yet had to draw and make use of those reserves that are currently in place that the MCA has set aside. So we have protection of priority services reserve still available, and we also have this additional funding that the department has made available to us. In addition to that, as I mentioned earlier in response to the actions, they've also extended the fare cap, and that now is running through to October of 2024. Our allocation from a funding perspective is 3.15 million of direct funding to the MCA for the remainder of this financial year, and we believe a further 3.15 subject to confirmation for the whole of 24-25. So we have an additional on top of our reserves somewhere to the tune of £6.3 million over the next 2 years to contribute towards protection bus services. However, to put that into context, we are facing somewhere in the tune of around 41-42 million pounds worth of potential services to buy back. So, whichever way we configure the situation we find ourselves in, we are unable to protect all of those services at the level of funding that would be otherwise required. To also just to give some context, and this is information that's become available to us more recently, just for members' for awareness, an adjacent MCA to us in West Yorkshire have received through this process and through access to their previous BSIP funding around £77 million worth of funding. So, in context, 77. And we have 6.3. So, it is very clear that we've got some very difficult decisions to make. Because of the complexity of those decisions and the potential implications on bus services in this region, and also our desire to continue to protect concessions, so namely young persons concessions, as to the question from the member earlier, but also in terms of the continuation of that fare cap on tram that we also described. The MCA took the decision on the 5th of June to put a temporary pause in the process instead of implementing a sustainable network from the end of July and deferring that decision to the start of September. So we have now entered in a very focused but at least available planning period where we will go through an iterative cycle of conversations both with the mayor and then with the leaders and then with elected members across the region to understand the choices that we have before us, where we spend our money in respect of bus services relative to concessions, relative to fares initiatives, and then put in place the contracts to deliver that. That has to be financially sustainable over, a time period of, we are suggesting at least 2 years. In terms of, just to answer the specific question from the member around the Young Persons Initiative, that was only budgeted initially through till the end of June of this year. Again, as I say, as per the decision taken on the 5th of this month, that's been extended through to the start of September, but it is unfunded beyond that point. The MCA will have a decision as to whether it continues to extend that scheme for 18 to 21-year-olds, and if that does indeed take place, there are also decisions therefore to be taken about whether it continues to be charged at the same rate for under 18s, or whether we have a differential price for young people 18 to 21 relative to under 18s as well. I think I've probably covered all of the information in the report. As I say, from a timescales perspective, the decision in terms of what that sustainable network and sustainable set of concessions and fares initiatives will be taken at the end of July, at the MCA board in July. We have various workshops and meetings taking place as we speak through late June into early July with the mayor and with the leaders, and we're planning ahead of publication and decisions for the MCA board at the end of July to do elected member consultation activity in early July. Currently planned for week commencing the 10th of July at this moment in time, but subject obviously to conversations and decisions taken by the leaders in the coming weeks. So I shall pause there if that's okay with members. Clearly happy to take any particular questions in terms of the process or indeed the finances involved.
Sinead first, question.
Thank you. Sorry, Tim. Could you explain the young people's fares, what's going to happen? Can you say it a bit more slowly for old ladies who are a bit deaf?
Indeed. So the 18 to 21 initiative, so Zoom Beyond as it's otherwise referred to at times, that's its kind of public name, was introduced by the previous mayor and was only ever introduced at its time as a one-year initiative. So that was put in place in June of 2021. We've obviously had a new mayor elected last year, and when the current mayor was elected to post, he took the decision to extend that for a further year, so through till June of this year that we're currently in. At that point in time, it was unfunded beyond the end of June of 2023. As I say, the decision has been taken and we are able to fund a further very short-term extension to that scheme through till September of this year. But if the scheme needs to remain beyond September of this year, it needs to be funded relative to those other cost pressures that I described in terms of protecting bus services, or indeed continuing a fare cap on tram beyond that period in time. So those are all balanced decisions that the MCA will need to take. Is that helpful?
So who will make that decision?
The MCA on the 31st of July.
Okay, next.
Yeah, it's a two-stage question really. It's in relation to the disabled persons bus pass. Has there been a tightening of the criteria for allocating those passes since the first were introduced? And second phase is that going to feature? I'm not asking for a crystal ball, but is that going to feature in any of the thoughts going forward in respect to the budget position?
So disabled bus pass issue and provision is a statutory obligation of the MCA, which is passported to us on behalf of local authorities. The eligibility criteria required to access that pass is set at local authorities, not by the MCA as a transport authority. So they define that with guidance from central government. So they do the qualification and the eligibility checks. They tell us who their residents are that are eligible for that scheme, and we then issue passes on the basis of that proof of eligibility. So there are no indications, there are no decisions at the moment in terms of us wanting to change the criteria for that in any shape or form, and if so, that's certainly done by central government in any event. DfT are in the process at the moment of undertaking a consultation on the National Travel Concession Scheme, which will look at the way the scheme is administered and is managed more generally, which includes both elderly and disabled people. That consultation and that review is taking place in the latter half of this calendar year, so we're expecting early indications October, November, with a view to implementing those changes to come into effect from April of 2024.
Just very quick, is there much sort of variation across the county then in respect of who gets the disabled persons pass? I mean, I'm not expecting you to answer, but maybe come back on that.
Happy to take an action to come back with some numbers on distribution of pass numbers and bypass that, because clearly for a number of one thing to make perfectly clear, for most people they have to requalify periodically to access that, either dependent on the changes in criteria to access the pass in the first place, or indeed their condition could improve and they may be in a position where actually they no longer qualify as a consequence of that. The only classification at the moment for which we do not require requalification is for blind people, because clearly it is highly unlikely that their eye conditions are going to return such that they are no longer eligible, but that's the only one we don't require requalification for. But yeah, happy to provide, by pass type and so forth, the information available.
Thank you. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Douglas next.
Yeah, thanks. There's some points there. Just looking at the big picture of the demo, and just thinking about where we are with the finances. I mean, you've referred to the fact that the funding from government is woeful and it's short term, which is very difficult to deal with. But I think you said that we've got 3.6 million available.
6.3 over the next 2 years.
6.3,
Yeah.
Right, okay. And I was going to ask about the time period in a moment. 6.3, but it's to meet a gap that you've estimated at 41 million. And I just want to clarify that. Is that the operational cost of services that are at risk?
So that's the total cost of potential tender services over the next 2 years,
Okay.
including daytime, evenings and Sunday services as well.
Right.
For which we have some budget, but it's clearly insufficient in the additional cost to plug that gap.
I mean, so the point is that there's a long shortfall there of the money that's available, and the question is, because it's not clear from the paper, what's the plan for deciding what we are going to spend this money on when there's a lot of pressures that you've outlined there, limited money by a long way, an area that's of a lot of public interest and will have real impacts on people all over the county, whichever way you look at it. What's the plan for squaring that circle, in other words?
So, if I explain briefly the process that we're going through, but I'll finish with a qualifying statement if I may. We undertook, in anticipation of these cuts taking place in October of last year, a public engagement process which asked people to tell us the attributes of bus services which were most important to them. So not name individual routes, please tell us, do you like the 52 over the 120 or whatever it may be, but more to the point, give us the attributes of what buses do for you in terms of access to various services. So that consultation came back and unsurprisingly told us that the things that mattered most to people were getting them to school or education, getting them to and from work, accessing healthcare, and then accessing other services more generally speaking. And as you work your way down the list of prioritisation, we very much got, towards the end it was, social purpose activities, evenings and Sundays. So thus far we have prioritised every service at risk on the basis of that prioritisation exercise that we undertook last year. We're going to retest that priority sequencing with the mayor and the leaders to make sure they're still satisfied that it's fit for purpose. Overlaid on top of that, and indeed on evenings and Sundays, which are at the moment at greater risk, we've then also individually analysed each service to understand if it still does one of those former things. So there may be a bus on a Sunday, but still provides connectivity to employment, or still provides access to hospitals, in which case its priority has been raised as a consequence of that. So that's from a prioritisation point of view. We've also looked at the cost per passenger, so clearly some services are used much more heavily than others, and we have choices around whether or not we can look at some thresholds in terms of a cost per passenger principle. Now, were we to apply that, what we're not necessarily saying is that those people will just not have access to a service, but we will have to investigate other alternatives, be that community transport, demand responsive transport or other, as a means to backfill should those services be lost. We are also looking at service frequency. So one of the options we do have, typically we tender buses at a minimum 1 hour frequency, which I think most people would accept is a reasonable frequency as a minimum standard. We could move to 2 hours, we could move to 90 minutes. That will clearly save some degree of money in terms of what you're buying as a service back from the operators. That may allow us to stretch the budget further, but still is insufficient to fully fill the gap. So those are some of the options that we have at our disposal. We've also segregated all of the services at risk by local authority. So each local authority, the leaders will be presented this information next week, can have a look and see what it means to them at a local authority level in terms of the potential services at risk. Following that process, we'll then revisit the recommendations. As I say, we'll go through a further decision-making process with the leaders in terms of making sure they're comfortable with the outcome of that process. And then we'll go into a process of doing the local authority elected member engagements, as I say, in early July, making sure that they understand the consequences of the recommendations that we've reached at that point in time, to further test whether our assumptions are indeed entirely valid, but also what that means as a consequence to local, to ward level effectively in terms of service implications. My qualifying statement, which I said I would finish on, whichever way we configure all of these things, there is currently no way that we can see that we can stretch this money sufficiently far enough to fill the gap. That just is an impossibility. We always knew that this cliff edge would come, because we always knew that the DFT central government funding would end at a point in time. It's not ended now, but it has dropped significantly enough for us to know that we can't fulfil and continue to fill that gap based on our current financial limits. So this is a process that we always knew we would have to face at some point in time. It has been made slightly better as a result of this funding being provided from DFT, but not by much, because, as I say, 3 million a year is relatively inconsequential given the scale of the challenge we face.
So I mean, just following off that, I mean, that is really useful, thanks Tim. And it's, as I said, an unenviable position that anyone's in when they've got to make this decision. Just in terms of the people engaged, you said there's going to be elected member engagements, that's all the members in all 4 authorities, presumably in, is it early July? Yep. Sounds good. Can you just, what's the proposal for involving the transport planners, officers in each of the local authorities? So they're going to be included in early stage, and then the other end of the spectrum, are the plans to engage the public in further in any sort of prioritisation and reflecting back to them. And I suppose the third tranche is about looking specifically at the needs of elderly and disabled people. Because as you know, I was asking for a copy of the equality impact assessments referred to in there, and I think we're now told that actually that's not been produced yet, but it will be. But the question is really when is that produced? Given that we know, it's like Ken's question, that we know that it's people who are disadvantaged who are most impacted by all the cuts in services that we're inevitably looking at.
So in terms of yes, indeed, it's across all 4 local authorities. We'll be expecting officers in each of the 4 local authorities to reach out and help facilitate that the activity at an elected member perspective in early July, as I've described. They are already cited in terms of the challenges we face. We've done sessions with the chief execs, we've sessions individually with the lead transport exec directors in each 4 local authorities to cover this topic. So there's already a clear and very understandable level of concern, but equally expectation that we need to solve this problem from those officers more generally. And they will also be involved in scrutinising our proposals from both their understanding as subject matter experts from a transport perspective, but also acting and interpreting what the political appetite is for these activities from each local authority. So there is a huge amount of effort going into this. As you say, it's somewhat unenviable, frankly, the position we find ourselves in, but it is a necessary task for us to fulfil. On the last point, so you're right, the quality impact assessment has been prepared, thus is in the process of being prepared, and will be published alongside the papers that come for approval at the end of July. Happy to share early drafts of that. Clearly it is critical, certainly, as you say, particularly for certain customer groups and for certain protected characteristic groups more generally. We will look to best mitigate against the impact on those individuals through whatever plans we can put in place. And I say, if there are times of day, days of week, certain communities that are affected as a consequence of these decisions, and inevitably there will be some people that will be affected because of the funding position. If there are other alternatives, be that community transport, DRT, or via some schemes that we're currently exploring, then we will do our best to try and mitigate against those. But as I say, the current fiscal environment means that there will be some cuts somewhere, and people will otherwise be affected. That's inevitable, unfortunately.
Thank you for that. I've got Zahira next.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Tim, for your presentation. Actually, Councillor Johnson's asked the questions that I wanted to ask around the finance. So I'd just like to clarify. We've got 6.3 million funding from the DFT, but we need 41 million to protect all the current service.
Yep.
Yep. Okay, so in terms of pressures, who will decide where the MCA make this savings? And also, option 2 talks about a significant reduction, and this will have an impact on evening and Sunday services. Will this also have an effect on daytime services? And my second question is, what's the process of requesting a bus service, or when a bus service was stopped or taken away in a community? Because literally, while I've been sat here, somebody just texts me to ask if they can reinstate a bus service in their community. So what is actually the process to request that? Thank you.
So from a decision-making process, that is the MCA that will be making that decision at the end of July. As I say, we are in the process of presenting options, presenting various scenarios, both to the Mayor and in due course to the leaders over the next few weeks, to give them options in terms of the policy choices that they'll need to take in respect to prioritising protecting bus services relative to continuing and protecting various initiatives such as Zoom Beyond and such as the £2 fare cap on tram. With those choices in mind, those options will then be presented through to yourselves in terms of that engagement. I would suggest that is a time in terms of particularly service reinstatement, if there are particular services either in totality or individually at times of day or days of week from a reinstatement perspective that you would like to see. We will consider those, but consider those objectively alongside all of the other priorities that the MCA faces. And clearly, if we try to reinstate everything that everyone would like to, then we'll be back where we started in terms of insufficient funding to cover those
Is there a step-by-step guide type thing that you have on this? Because that'd be quite useful to know, and to have that would be. I mean, I know it sounds very simplistic, but is there a step on the process that you go through with a service, whether it's either a reinstatement or whether it's a service being withdrawn, on how what the steps that you will go through, or the steps that either the public or councillors have to go through in order to intercede at that point, and what point they need to intercede, and what is and when the evaluation is done.
There isn't a how-to guide that we would only give out to councillors on this basis. I'm happy to draft out and set out the process that we follow. This process is no different to any other time that we've had to go through this kind of exercise in terms of appraising and considering which bus services are protected. However, this is the first time that we've faced a significant risk of services being reduced to the extent that it has obvious detrimental effects on
It would be very good for generally, because we can't presume, and it's part of transparency, so that we know what the system is, and not just us, but people outside this room know what the process and when and how they need to intercede, and what the level of evidence, etc., they need to produce or expected to produce.
I think just to emphasise the point, if it's not clear, the reason we are doing all of this activity is only as a consequence of operators taking commercial decisions to cut services. This isn't something that the MCA is saying, we want to create a problem here. This is us responding to circumstance of operators making commercial cuts, us trying, at our best to fill those gaps in the market that are being cut because. In their position, they're either not making a profit or indeed potentially not even enough profit, and there's nothing to stop us from allowing them to make those choices at this moment in time. So it is unenviable in that regard, but members do need to be clear. This is us responding to commercial decisions.
Thank you for that, Hannah.
Thanks, Tim. I've got a couple of questions, Tim, if that's all right. First of all, you mentioned the amount of funding that West Yorkshire Combined Authority is getting, which is significantly greater than ours. Can you give us any kind of insight into the reason behind that tens of millions discrepancy?
So, of that 77 million, 70 was awarded to West Yorkshire through the competitive BSIP Bus Service Improvement Plan process, for which South Yorkshire didn't get a single penny. So we were unsuccessful in our BSIP allocation process last year. They received a further 7 million through the BSIP Plus process, and that's the process by which we got 6.3 million. So I don't know if Chief Exec wants to comment. I know he's had discussions with DFT officials in terms of the parity of that process, but certainly we've raised our concerns with the department and made very clear that we feel we're being left high and dry here in respect of the relative quantum of funding that we're getting in South Yorkshire relative to other parts of the country, because West Yorkshire have now discretion as to how they use that 77 million.
Can I bring you in now?
Yeah.
For best time?
Absolutely. And nice to see everyone, and some councillors for the first time, so good to see you. Good to see you again, Douglas. So on this particular issue, BSIP, it was a model and a competitive funding process that DFT introduced, which was about transformational funding for bus. If I go back, it was probably 2 years or so ago when they announced it. This organisation, led by Steve Edwards at the time, in the transport team, over a long period of time put together a very detailed plan around how we would try and transform bus services, and that was broken down into considerable detail. Councillors might recall it. I'm sure some councillors contributed to it, and actually we felt it was a fairly robust,
Was that the bus review, or was that a separate document?
The bus review, it depends. Bus service improvement plan, it was called a BSIP.
It was a separate, entirely separate
Completely separate.
exercise.
Thank you.
And from memory, we bid for over 300 million, which was to see us through a number of years, but would allow the scale of investment that we thought would certainly make significant difference to bus services in South Yorkshire of a transformational nature. Our colleagues in West Yorkshire received around 70 million. Our colleagues in Manchester, from memory, 80 million thereabouts, and we received nothing. Now, we have had feedback from that process. Frankly, with all of the funding bids, this bidding process that we've had to go through for a number of different sources of funds, the feedback is never really that thorough or detailed. And actually, I think that, and I've made it really clear to DFT that I felt it was completely the wrong process in the first place. And even before bidding, we made our position sort of clear on that, but we were very constructive in trying to work with DFT to achieve the best we could. So I think it was the wrong process. I think it has led to even greater disparity between regions instead of a more distributed model that would have seen each region benefit to some extent. Even 20 million of that funding would have been of great help to us. Now, in theory, that BSIP funding was for transformational purposes, not for the day-to-day services as described by Tim over the last 20 minutes. However, each of those authorities that I mentioned, Wycombe, Manchester, I'm absolutely sure will be using their BSIP funding to support the challenges that they're dealing with right now.
And if I may, DFT being absolutely clear that that's now what they expect those areas to do. So no longer was that BSIP funding originally just for purely transformational stuff. They've now been told you need to make decisions about the balance of still potentially transformational stuff using that funding, and protecting the core network. So they may choose to spend all of that 70 million in West Yorkshire on just protecting the core network, if they so choose.
So, Chair, if I may, just to finish that point, despite where we got to, we have continued to lobby DFT, Treasury, government for additional support. The Mayor has, in meetings with the Bus Minister. I have, as recently as this week, with the lead director in DFT for Bus. I have with the DGs, we are the Director Generals, who are responsible. I have with Treasury in Whitehall. However, we are being advised now that there is no more funding.
So on that, and I assume not just no more allocated funding, no more funding to bid for. I know we don't like that process, but there's no more opportunity to bid for more coming up either.
Certainly at the moment there's no indication there's a future bidding opportunity here now.
So given that, and given the fairly dire situation you've sort of been laying out to us, how does this situation stack up against the Mayor's stated objectives, one of his election pledges, to move forward with the franchising process? How do we marry this situation up against that ambition? Because clearly this isn't sustainable.
Without wanting to talk too much on behalf of the Mayor, clearly these things are at odds, and the Mayor is aspirational in providing a significantly improved bus network. It clearly creates a greater focus on the desire and the accelerated nature of wanting to undertake a bus franchising assessment, the timescales of which are still broadly keeping to what may have been previously discussed with this board before, but just in essence, recommendations in terms of the assessment process at the end of this year, public consultation from the end of this year into early next year, and then a formal decision taken in, I believe, February or March of next year, 2024. Now, should that decision be taken at that point, clearly a franchise network is not implemented in a matter of months. You are talking significant timescales to do that exercise. So we'll consider that in due course. But what is important, I'm sure, and again, without wanting to talk too much on behalf of the leaders and the Mayor, is to put in place something which provides at least a level of stability during that period of time to allow us to A, take the decision, and B, transition away from what might be the existing arrangements into a future potential franchise network. And I think stability is certainly the key message that's been communicated to us thus far.
Josh? Thanks, Chair. I mean, it's fine to scrutinise government, right? But, I mean, we aren't here to do that, so maybe we'll just leave that up for a parliamentary committee to do that. So, I mean, really, does it really just come down to the MCA's bid then? And will the MCA now undertake a review on its bid and seek further reasons why the bid failed?
So, we are always trying to improve and refine our bids or our bidding approach and processes within the MCA. I think, if I'm frank with you, that process is well gone now. I think we received the outcome of BSIP must be 12 months or so ago. We have made further bidding rounds since for the funding that Tim's just described. So I think we'll continue to learn as we move forward with this. Right now, and post the BSIP, we worked with our colleague authorities, the two of whom I've just mentioned, also Liverpool, to see, to look at their bids and comparing ours. I have to say, they're in the view of the team and examining those other bids, there wasn't a real clear reason to us why we should have been unsuccessful.
And you know that because you took it under, you reviewed your bid then, is that how you know that, or is that just what you think?
No, it's well, We reviewed at the time the feedback that we got, and then we reviewed the other authorities' bids that had made and who were successful, and compared and contrasted. And in summary here to you now, as opposed to having all of the detail at the time, ours was a very credible bid.
Obviously, the government doesn't agree with you.
Clearly.
So the question really is, what lessons have you learned from that to go forward? You know, because clearly it's not a partisan issue. If you've seen other authorities of different colours receive funding.
Yeah.
So it's just a question of, you know, this authority, what has this authority done differently? And you've just described not much, but clearly the government doesn't agree with that. So has there been a formal review taken place? If not, will there be?
Yeah, and in fact right now we are looking at how we might improve bids moving forward, and we're working with external organisations to try and help us with that.
Thank you for that, Sinead. Sorry.
Yeah, there was a full stop after the thank you for that, wasn't it?
It was trying to move people on.
I suppose my question is sort of similar, that we asked for, or we bid for about 300,000. Did the other authorities also make large bids, or did they have, so they, I don't know, maybe they bid for 500,000 but got 80, and we bid for 300,000 and got nothing?
Yeah.
I wasn't quite sure whether we should have had a less ambitious plan.
So
also, I just wanted to suggest to Councillor Bacon that perhaps through your own back channels you could find out some of the information that we haven't been able to get, and speak to your government colleagues about what went wrong, so that we actually have some information from all sides. That would be a really helpful thing to do, Joshua, and you could bring that back to us at the next meeting, couldn't you?
You can make a brief point as it was aimed at you for this on this, and then we'll move on to the next. Okay.
Just want to say that this committee isn't partisan chair. It's not for me as a borough councillor that represents Aston and Todwick to do such a thing. It's for the Mayoral Combined Authority to do that in their bid, Chair. Thank you.
I would just suggest that we do want to make the best, because we're here to support it, and if we're able to do those things in order to find out, I mean, I would certainly be speaking to colleagues that I have in order to make that happen. I'm just a bit surprised that Councillor Bacon just feels able to criticise but not actually go and do anything.
No, the only thing I would say is during the coalition I was able to ring Norman Baker up, who was responsible for the buses, to make sure that we had the quality bus contracts put into place and put into legislation. So it is something you can do with back channels. Anyway, Douglas, move on.
Sure, yes, okay.
Chair, I'm conscious I haven't answered Councillor's question. Is that okay?
Sorry.
Quite honestly, it was a year or so ago, and I can't recall what the scale of the other authorities' bids were. I do think they were similar values to ours, and I think at the time we were encouraged to be very ambitious, and you would have expected us as councillors from across South Yorkshire to be very ambitious. So I don't think we were beyond our remit in the scale of submission. And obviously we've had to move on from that point, but what we are trying to do is that a number of the good plans that were within that BSIP submission, we still hold true to them and will, wherever we possibly can, implement. Gareth?
Right, sorry, Chair, just a little bit of flavour to this. So government's intention when they ran the bus service improvement programme was to identify almost pilot activity, innovative activity that would be run to work out what transformation might look like in different places. So they really encouraged people to bid incredibly heavily with huge bids going into government, and then they pick winners and losers. So it's fairly inequitous in how they did it. What has changed is that government have now said, oh, that transformational money, you can just use it to fund your core services. So the announcement was for one thing. What's actually panned out is something different, and that's where it's led to a real regional disparity. So we may have benefited in time if colleagues in West Yorkshire ran an incredibly innovative scheme, and we all worked out that that was a more efficient way to run bus services. But we don't even get the benefit of that now, because they're just using that money to run their core service network, which we now can't afford to do in a way. So it's created regional disparities, and it's not actually got that innovation that we hoped it might do. So the scheme was kind of flawed in the first place, created inequity, and now it's not being used for the purpose that it was initially intended.
Thank you very much for that. I've only final question from Douglas wants to come back in.
Yeah, thanks. So in terms of scrutiny, I mean, I think to be fair, it is perfectly reasonable for this committee to scrutinise the issues of government, and you know, we've often said, haven't we, that you know, this idea of competitive funding for bus services is just not a way to run a local bus service at a national level. And I think that, you know, it's also fair to say that actually the correct channel isn't asking council for Aston and Todwick to take that up with government, but I think we could actually have an expectation that we ask officers here to feed back the concerns that we've all expressed today to government. In terms of the BSIP, I mean, I'm just having a bit of a think of, we are where we are, and you know, what's the issue we really need to scrutinise here? And I think we've got some really interesting, you know, important information. I think, Martin, you've been clear that the BSIP was a one-off exercise that's not going to be repeated. We haven't really got the option of reopening the BSIP process, have we? And Tim, you've made clear that there's no prospect of further funds. I mean, we know that the government's been limping on with, you know, diminishing handouts of government funding to prop up bus services now, and I think all the indications are, you know, it's not going to go on forever. We've already identified a really significant funding gap that we needed to prop that up. So I think we do have to ask ourselves questions. What we're going to do, because in put all this together, the only prospect is, you know, a continually diminishing and rapidly diminishing bus service across all of South Yorkshire, which is what we all know is the last thing we want to do. So it comes back to, well, what is the plan? Do we need to start thinking now about something that is more radical? And I'm going back to the bus service improvement plan, because I mean, it's well known. I mean, I took issue slightly with what you said there, Martin. I completely respect the views there. At the time the BSIP was going through, I did say it was not ambitious enough, and that's why I didn't vote for it when it came to the Transport and Environment Group.
You have a question, Douglas, because we've got to get...
I do have a question, yeah, that's right, yeah. But the point about that is, do we need to get to the point where we do have a rethink about that, and what is the role of the bus companies in there? Because we perhaps need to ask, well, so where is the synergy between what we want at the MCA and the local authorities across here for people of South Yorkshire and the commercial interests of the bus companies, who also won't benefit from a continually fading bus market? Are there some things that we can rescue from the BSIP and from their commercial interests that we can pull together and try and make things better? I'm thinking about sort of, you know, cross-ticketing, you know, tap-on, tap-off stuff, all the stuff about marketing that we can perhaps do collectively. Is there something that we can work on there that we perhaps need some more political impetus behind to give you some go-ahead to do that?
Yeah, if I may answer that. All of those things you suggested and other things besides are things that were incorporated into our enhanced partnership. So in order to even make a bid for BSIP funding when the competitive process ran, you had to either be already on the process to assess franchising or have an enhanced partnership in place. So we had no alternative other than to establish the EP at that point in time. The enhanced partnership has got now in it a number of those things. So we've got initiatives to look at fare simplification, initiatives in terms of rolling out tap-on, tap-off, fare capping across the region, some fairly significant marking activity as well as consolidating routes and other things besides that we're asking the operators to do. In amongst all of that, there are also some performance targets that we want to hold operators to account against as well. The enhanced partnership, whilst it is a statutory function in its own right, it doesn't, we believe, give us the power to mandate operators to do certain things because they still have an element of degree of choice. And clearly we can't make them continue to run bus services or provide fair discounts, for example, if there is no commercial incentive for them to do that. So, we are frustrated at one level that we would like to get more out of the enhanced partnership, and clearly had we had the BSIP funding available, that would have been the vehicle to certainly facilitate that, and I'm sure we'd find ourselves in a very different position at this point in time if that were the case.
Thank you very much. We'll move on.
Councillor, Chair, if I may, just a quick technical point. Councillor Douglas said that I had said there would not be any further BSIP funding or bids. I have no idea.
We haven't seen to spring them on anyway, as we've seen over many years. The government will suddenly come up with a funding stream that they've got. So yeah. Is that the completion of your report, Tim? I believe so. What I'm aiming to do now is to bring in the Mayor. Welcome to our meeting.
Thank you.
And we'll move over to your part of the item on the agenda. Okay.
Well, thank you, and first of all, congratulations on your election to the glamorous role of Chair. Well, Chair, if it's okay with you, I think thank you for the invitation to speak. And last time we went through this process, essentially this became a Q&A, and I'm suggesting, if it's all right with you, that we launch straight into that, because I think that was probably the most useful part of that conversation. So I'm happy just to sort of spend as much time as possible answering questions, if that's okay with you, and just launch straight in.
I thought you were just going to give us a quick rundown of what you've been up to and what you're into, then give us a sort of intro to the questions, and we'll allow the members of the committee to think of some questions.
I'm more than happy to, if you'd like me to just sort of talk about some of the things that we're up to.
Just a quick
Absolutely.
2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, so yes, today I've been in Manchester with Transport for the North Board. That follows Rail North Committee a couple of weeks ago, and we have been pushing Transport for the North to be much more assertive about South Yorkshire's needs. Today we were talking specifically about the Manchester to South Yorkshire corridor, particularly over the Hope Valley line, and what needs to be done there to restore services to Manchester Airport, but also the additional services to Manchester that we have lost. We were talking about the Leeds area study, and I was pressing Transport for the North to be much more assertive with the government about releasing the terms of reference for the Leeds area study, which are now over a year delayed. Hugh Merriman, the Transport Minister, promised me that he was pushing the Treasury for that, for those terms of reference. I believe him for what it's worth, but I also know that it's still not come out yet, and that is a problem for the whole of the North, not just for Leeds and Sheffield. So that was today. Yesterday I was at a health inquiry that's being chaired by Andy Burnham, again over in Manchester, talking about some of the work that we're doing on health. So we have established clearly the Health Equity Advisory Panel. Through the ICP, we're focusing now very clearly on health inequalities, and there's some great work I think that's going on through the ICP alongside colleagues from across South Yorkshire, other parties included in that. So I'm very grateful for the support that I've had on the ICP and the work that we're doing there. Big push on growth clearly in South Yorkshire, and what we need to do in terms of fulfilling our growth ambitions. I'm sure that there will be questions around our potential investment zone that we're now negotiating and co-designing with government. We have announced the place plans for most of South Yorkshire, albeit still working with Sheffield on the place plans there, which are both ambitious and I think incredibly exciting. That includes the work that we're intending to do in Doncaster to save Doncaster Sheffield Airport, which is I think a good step forward. So there's a bunch of things going on. I'm happy to talk about any of them, but I'll not take any more time if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Ken. Ken, first question.
Thanks very much. I mean, Mayor, you mentioned the connectivity between South Yorkshire and Manchester particularly, and that we know that Transpennine Express has been taken into public ownership for the time being because of the catastrophic level of service that they've been providing or not providing with on the day cancellations. And obviously since the service has lost Doncaster Airport, it's been quite a problem for people of South Yorkshire to actually access air travel to Manchester.
Yep.
Using public transport. The alternative by road is a 1930 single carriageway road over the Pennines, or going up to the south of Leeds and turning left. So is there any sort of progress on that field with connectivity between South Yorkshire and Manchester Airport, etc.
Yeah, so I'm sure colleagues know this, but just in case, Doncaster and Sheffield are the two biggest cities in the Western world without a rail connection to an international airport, which is, I think, the kind of crux of your point. We had Transport for the North Chair and Chief Exec in last week, and we're very clear, I think, with them about our expectations about TfN's role in helping us to try and restore some of those services. So we've obviously lost the service over to Manchester Airport. I don't think that's I don't think that's okay, and we're fighting hard to restore those services. I can't promise you that that's going to happen, but I'm certainly fighting as hard as I can, and I think we're hearing more positive noises from both TfN and operators about that restoration. When it comes to Leeds, because clearly, you know, Leeds Airport is also important now, given the context. That Leeds area study is also an important part of that. I think it's a disgrace, quite honestly, that it's taken a year just to get the terms of reference. But we do have to have more services up to Leeds as well. The fact that we sit within 35, 40 miles of Manchester, of Leeds, and actually of Nottingham, and the Midland Main Line electrification is also an important part of what we want to do. And yet we have substandard services to all three of those core cities is not okay. So we're doing everything we can to make the most of those connections and restore the connections where they've been lost, but get them in place where they hadn't ever been there. There is also a question in there, I think, about Doncaster Airport. There was a plan for a Midland Main Line station at Doncaster Airport. That was a £300 million bid that we put in before my time, but I think worth mentioning, which was turned down by government. We had asked for an extension to the Lincoln Line out there, which was, I think, probably more likely, but that was just at the same time as obviously Doncaster Airport was closed by Peel. So we need to reopen the airport. We're working hard to do that, and then improve connectivity over to Doncaster Sheffield Airport, either actually possibly by tram train or through a mainline station. So we're doing all we can on all fronts actually in that regard. As I'm sure you know, as I'm increasingly aware, anything on rail takes years. It just takes years. So, you know, we are fighting now for what will probably a 1, 2, 3 year process in order to restore or bring in those services, but we will keep on fighting that fight because I think it's fundamental to how we want to grow the economy and increase connectivity in South Yorkshire.
Zahira,
Thank you, Chair. Hi, Oliver. I'm really interested to know a little bit more about the Health Inequalities Board. What work is happening, and I'm sure you can't talk about all the work that's going on, but I'd be really interested to find out, you know, how we could kind of get more information regarding that. Thank you.
So first and foremost, I'm the chair of the Integrated Care Partnership in South Yorkshire, and I'm the only mayor in the country to have taken on that role. I think that was, if perfectly honest, that was more luck than judgment, in the sense that the timing of that was just helpful, and we grabbed that with both hands when that opportunity came up, because I was very clear in my manifesto when I was running for mayor that health inequalities and making South Yorkshire the healthiest region in the country, which is a significant goal and not an easy one, was fundamental to what I wanted to do with my time as mayor. So taking on the role of the Integrated Care Partnership, and then through the Integrated Care Strategy, which we've now launched and is available if you'd like to have a look at that, has health inequalities front and centre. I've talked about this a lot, but you know, South Yorkshire has a 20-year healthy life expectancy gap. So the poorest parts in South Yorkshire, actually specifically there are some parts of Doncaster where this is the case, have healthy life expectancy which is somewhere in the mid-50s, versus other parts of South Yorkshire where it's mid-70s. You can work until your mid-70s usually, and that's just simply not okay, quite honestly. And yet for too long we've sort of put it in this box marked too difficult, do not touch it, and I'm determined to get it out of that box. So the ICP and the work we're doing then with colleagues across the NHS and local authorities in terms of place is part of that. Equally, we've now set up an independent health equity advisory panel separate to the ICP, but working with ICP colleagues. That's chaired by Professor Alan Walker from the Healthy Lifespan Institute, who is an internationally renowned figure in this world. Sir Michael Marmot's team are also on that health equity advisory panel, who again is another worldwide expert. We've brought in Harvard and Bloomberg philanthropies to help us and support us in that work and on that journey. They've got some specific ideas around early years and what we could do with the early years provision, and how we might be able to help early years provision to support a healthier lifespan more broadly in health inequalities. A baby born in Rotherham today is likely to die 5 years younger than a baby born in Richmond in London on the very same day, and that's just not okay. So there's a bunch of work right across that piece. We will come out with a report through the Health Equity Advisory Panel which will offer advice to local authorities and to me as the ICP chair about how we can address health inequalities specifically in South Yorkshire, and I'm really looking forward to that report. I think that will be really important, but more broadly there is just this long slog of work that we have to do through the ICP and through health services and through local authorities in order to try and address health inequalities. The clean air zone is part of that, quite honestly. Improving public transport is part of that. Active travel is part of that. Better work is part of that. And there are all sorts of things that we have to do in South Yorkshire, because social determinants of health are a huge reason why we are unhealthy in South Yorkshire, too unhealthy. So I'm conscious of the breadth of that work, and it's not something this organisation or I can do alone, but we're working with partners to do everything we can, and I would welcome any support from colleagues to make that happen.
Thank you very much, Sinead.
Hello, Oliver.
Hello.
I was just going to say, you don't have to compare with Richmond. You can just say between Dore and Burngreave.
Absolutely.
The 13 years life expectancy difference.
Absolutely.
I actually wanted to write two things. One, very quickly, Sheffield Young Carers say that they had written to you to ask if they could meet with you. I don't know whether they have managed that in the time that they spoke to me and haven't had a meeting, but can you chase it up?
I can. I think we have got something in the diary, but I will check that and chase it up.
That's
yeah,
fine.
Yeah, absolutely.
My other one was just to ask about people are talking about the moving of the PCC role into the mayoral role, and I wondered, has there been a paper? What are the plans? What are you able to tell us so far?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm happy to be as upfront as I possibly can be about all of it, really, because it needs to be a matter of public debate. So we put a paper through the MCA at the last MCA meeting, which kind of outlined where we are currently, and essentially no decision finally has been made yet, partly because we can't do that alone in South Yorkshire. The government themselves, through the Levelling Up white paper, said that their intention was where there was a contiguous boundary between mayors and PCCs, that in an ideal world they would like to see those two jobs marry up. I think that makes sense. Personally, I think that there is a lot of merit to that argument, not least because of the way in which we can then join up services across the piece, and things like, for instance, NHS provision around mental health, and the way in which the police are often brought in to deal with some of those crises, often on the weekend particularly. We would be able to, in that world, get more involved in kind of joining up the dots across those two services. So we're in the process of having this conversation with DLUC, with Home Office, who are the two departments responsible in this instance, about whether or not we can move this at pace to be able to take this decision this year. If we are able to take that decision this year, then that would mean that next year there is an election in South Yorkshire to elect both the mayor and the PCC, which would be a joint role at that point. Important to probably point out, it is not the MCA and the PCC. The PCC is specifically endowed upon the office of the mayor, so it's a slightly different set of functions and a slightly different system, albeit probably with a deputy in place at that point. But I just want to be very clear, no decisions have been made yet. I'm very keen to have conversations with anybody that wants to talk to me about that, including any community groups that may be listening to this. I'm very happy to kind of engage in that conversation, because I'm keen to gain views on how...
When you talk about conversation, what sort of is it going to be a consultation? Because sometimes a conversation can be a bit, not as formal, not as, but it needs to. But it's going to be a formality, so we can get out to the communities, so you can get out to communities. The mayoral authority can get out to the communities to speak, to make sure that we get the right system in place.
So what it won't be is one of those local government consultations where we put a website address up somewhere obscure and say, if you've got a real bee in your bonnet about this, please fill in this web form, and it will go somewhere obscure. I'm absolutely determined to have a conversation with our community. So if you want to call that a consultation, and we will do that in the most formal way, but I'm happy to call it a consultation. Legally speaking, there is no legal requirement for a consultation, but I don't think that absolves us of the responsibility to have a conversation, which is why I use the term, with our communities about what this means and how we are going to address that problem of kind of joining up services across South Yorkshire, be it with a mayor and PCC in a combined role, or if that doesn't happen, how we're going to do this better anyway, because I think it's important that the services have to join up.
Bearing in mind that we are your scrutiny committee here,
yes.
What are you proposing around scrutiny? At the moment, there is a separate police and crime panel.
Yes.
What have you decided, or sorry, have there been discussions, or do you want to come and have a conversation with us about it?
I would absolutely.
how it will happen?
I would absolutely. We're not at a point yet where there is a conversation about scrutiny, simply because we haven't taken the fundamental decision about whether this is going to happen or not yet, and the model that might ensue from that. So I don't want to sort of jump the gun and start talking about systems that may be in place when we haven't even taken the decision. But I would absolutely welcome a conversation with members of this committee about how we make sure that the scrutiny is of the highest order. South Yorkshire Police, as we all know, has been in a difficult position and has been brought into, I think, a really outstanding place thanks to the leadership of Alan Billings. And I think we want to make sure that whatever we do next doesn't just replicate what's been going on through Alan's time, but actually then enhances that wherever possible as well. So I'm really happy and keen to have that conversation with members of Scrutiny here, and then indeed, as I say, kind of other experts in that field.
The only addition I'd say to that is because obviously, if the government gives the go-ahead, and as we know, we've just been talking about funding, how they just suddenly spring things on, is that I presume the day after the election next May, then the mayor, if it's given the go-ahead, will be the
Police and Crime Commissioner.
successor to the Police and Crime Commissioner, and so systems will have to have been planned to be in place.
Indeed, and and for what it's worth, I have every confidence. We have somebody here in the senior team in South Yorkshire who was the Director of Police and Fire in Manchester. Now, they've not been brought in to do that role here, but it certainly gives us the sort of brain power and the institutional memory of how that works in a place like GMCA where this has already happened. And so we have, I think, experts who can help us kind of navigate that. And I'm confident, given what's already in place, that we can absolutely kind of carry forward the process that's already there. And then, as I say, kind of as and when possible, actually enhance the scrutiny and the public accountability. Because I do think actually having a mayor who is also the PCC actually raises up the amount of scrutiny that role will then be subject to. And I think that can only be a good thing for scrutiny of the functions of the Police and Crime Commission.
Sorry, Chair, can we just ensure that we think about that when we're having our meeting about our work plan for this year?
Please, that'd be great. Thank you.
Can that be factored in as part of what we will be discussing as that part of the meeting?
And we will formally write to you and let you know if that is going, if as and when that decision has happened, we will formally write to you and let you know. It might be, far be it from me to kind of suggest topics for this, but if you did want to hold a specific session on that topic, and we can bring in officers to talk to you about what's going on, then I think we would probably be, I'm looking hopefully over in Martin's direction at this point, I think we would be happy to be under that sort of scrutiny.
Thank you, that'd be most well. Move on to Hannah.
Thanks, Tim. Hi, Oliver. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
I think just on what we were just discussing there, there were clearly precedents for this happening in Greater Manchester, also West Yorkshire.
Yeah.
Exactly the same. When Tracy won that election, she took up that dual role. So I'm sure everyone in the room and beyond is well capable of making that happen smoothly. I asked when we were having our little chat about buses just before you arrived. I asked Tim a couple of questions, which I think he quite fairly said he didn't want to answer on behalf of you. So now you are here, so I will ask you.
Yeah.
So obviously it's been sort of laid clear to us today and previously the pretty dire situation that we're facing with South Yorkshire's bus network and the cliff edge, as Tim described it, in terms of funding for that. And what I asked was, obviously, when you were campaigning to be elected, you campaigned on quite a clear platform of implementing franchising, which was not a new idea, something that obviously Clive Betts has been speaking about for some time. Dan has mentioned previously as well. So really pleased to see that in your election manifesto. And given that we're now sort of facing this really quite dire situation in terms of the status quo and how we maintain that status quo, how does that sit against your aspirations to move forward with franchising? And specifically, I have asked you this question before in a less formal
I know what you're going to ask me. Yeah.
Oliver,
yeah.
How are you going to get all of the South Yorkshire council leaders on board with that?
I can't imagine who you might be meaning there when
you
say that.
I know that Sir Houghton in particular has been very clear and very public about his opposition to bus franchising.
Okay. So first and foremost, just in terms of the state of the bus network, I think sometimes I go to public meetings and I think people expect me to sort of defend what's going on in South Yorkshire somehow, and I just can't. I mean, there is no world in which what is happening to South Yorkshire's public transport network is okay. The things that keep me up at night, specifically, are buses. And I, when I think about the work that we're doing in South Yorkshire, not least things like talking about this PCC integration, when I think about the work we're doing on growth and health, you know, none of that is easy, but I think in the long term I'm really ambitious and quite bullish about where we can get to in South Yorkshire. When I think about buses, it's the one area where genuinely I kind of really worry about the state that we're in and what we're going to do to get out of that. So none of this is easy. I think it's probably the starting point, and I think everybody recognises that. I think certainly the funding situation has made that especially hard here in South Yorkshire, and I think we are all now feeling the effects of that come through in a way that other places simply aren't. Being over in Manchester, for instance, it was very clear the amount of extra money that Manchester has in that system, and as well, I should say, to be fair, also the specific advantages they have when it comes to geography. So they have a core city surrounded by a number of smaller places, and the density of that urban geography allows them to develop bus services which are much easier to run. South Yorkshire being 4 urban centres surrounded by a huge amount of green space, and specifically the challenges in places like Doncaster and Barnsley make it much harder to run a commercially viable service. So I don't say that any of this is easy, and I'm certainly not starting from a good place. I am committed absolutely to fixing public transport, no matter how long that might take, and the way in which I think we get through that is by franchising the service as soon as we can. Now, I can't say that that is what we're going to do, because we have to, and I can feel Steve looking worried. We have to absolutely rightly take a decision based on the evidence that we are given by the assessment process, and that is absolutely right, and we will do that. If you're asking for my political view, I've made it very clear in my election, so I'm not running away from any of that. But I think we need to go through that process as quickly as we can. We've put our best people on it. We've accelerated that process. I think we're doing that quicker than anyone else in the country, frankly. And so we will get there as quickly as we possibly can. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to do that relatively soon in the grand scheme of things. But it's a process set by government, so I would do it sooner if I could. We would all do it sooner if we could. But it's set by government, and we're subject to those rules. When it comes to kind of making the case to other leaders in South Yorkshire, I think, look, I'm not going to speak for Steve or Ros or anybody else, but quite honestly, I think in my experience, all of the leaders of South Yorkshire are entirely pragmatic when it comes to buses. And in the bus, in the situation we face with buses, I think everybody recognises that the status quo just simply can't carry on. And there also are very few levers that we have to be able to make that better. So when we do have a lever, albeit quite an expensive lever, to be quite honest, and that is not unreasonably Steve's challenge, and he's right to worry about that, because frankly the government should be helping us to fund some of this stuff, be it whoever the government are, and I will be making the same case if we have a Labour government that we need support for our bus network, but we need to make sure that the decision that we take is sustainable and that we can grow from there. I think there is a way through this which probably recognises and respects the different opinions of place. So, you know, there is a world, and franchising is not a big bang moment. It is not a moment in time. We take the decision on the Thursday, and on the Friday, all of a sudden there's buses coming out your ears. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. So we will take the decision as soon as we can, and when we take the decision, we'll then have to do a load of work about the implementation. And by and large, I mean, I was in Manchester, as I say, and you know, Andy has said, and it has kind of taken the decision around franchising. They're starting to franchise their routes. There's still loads of stagecoach buses and all the rest of it running very visibly. It's not all big yellow, you know, B buses over in Manchester yet, because it takes time to do this stuff. So we will do it piece by piece, and we will bring our kind of partners along the way with us as we do that. I can't speak for Steve, as you know, but I'm absolutely going to be making the case. That's where I stand. I'm being very clear about it, and I've got no doubt that Steve will be absolutely pragmatic when we take those decisions, and we will take the decisions in the best interest of everybody across South Yorkshire.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really good to hear that that's still your position, and that's the leadership that you're providing. And I think, you know, obviously none of us can speak for Steve, but it's just so clear to me that even if there was more money from government, so even if, like West Yorkshire, we had an additional 77 million, that 77 million is still just a sticking plaster. You know, it would still just be a sticking plaster. And the aspirations of that funding with the acronym I've already forgotten, that you applied for and didn't get anything on, was about that big transformational change. And I think it's pretty clear to all public transport users in South Yorkshire that that's what's needed. There's no point keeping on propping up bus companies and sticking plaster over the problem.
I absolutely agree with you. I mean, the 74 one or the other, million that we applied for, I think I have to disagree. I think was ambitious, and the feedback, albeit limited, that we've had from government was that we were too ambitious, quite honestly, and you know, their argument was we asked for too much money. I disagree. I think we asked for an appropriate amount of money for South Yorkshire, and it would have made a significant difference. It was the amount of money that frankly was promised. You know, there was 3 billion initially promised. It turned out to be 1.2 2, I think, or something. So we do need a significant injection of funds. 77 would have made a significant difference to South Yorkshire because the franchising process will take a significant amount of investment. That upfront cost is the thing that worries me about franchising. I'm absolutely committed to it, but we've got to work through the money of that, and we can't magic cash up. So 77 would have made a huge difference to some of that, and every penny that we don't get from government, we have to find somewhere else. So 77 million that would have gone into, for instance, routes, we're having to find for elsewhere or cut routes. And, you know, like you say, this is all just sticking plasters until and unless we can actually start turning the tank around by changing how the system works.
Thank you. I've got Ken next.
Just want to return to the PCC integration for a while. Around the country, there have been different PCCs have been having conversations and more than conversations about sort of becoming fire commissioners as well. And you know, clearly you've made several references to joining up services. Have you any sort of thoughts you could share with us in respect to becoming the fire commissioner as well? Is that going to come into the? You say there's a person who was a joint director of police and fire being appointed. Where are we going with that one?
So I mean, I think the fire service is a much bigger beast in some ways and very different because of the sort of the way in which the fire service works in terms of political scrutiny already, etc. So I think there are sort of different challenges in the fire service, but also different opportunities in the sense that the reason why there would have to be an election next year if we do get the go-ahead to integrate is because Alan Billings is an elected official. He is elected to lead the Police and Crime Commissioner functions. It is not the same case when it comes to fire. So you are able to do the fire service integration without an election, which means that actually you can probably look at that on a different timetable as and when. And I do worry a little bit about biting off more than we can chew. So were we to take on police and fire at the same time, I think that would be a significant amount of work that we wouldn't necessarily kind of want to do all at once. So I think taking this stuff progressively over time with support from potentially the next Labour government to do that in a sensible way would seem like a better approach. And I think that's probably where we are as an organisation, is that actually doing this in a more piecemeal fashion, a more sensible and timely manner probably makes sense for all the different organisations involved rather than simply trying to kind of bring those in all at once.
Thank you very much. I've got Josh and then Douglas, then we'll have after that because we're getting tight for time.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to raise with you, Oliver, that it's actually easier to get from outer Liverpool to Sheffield than it is from Sheffield to large parts of Rother Valley. Now, I think that in itself tells us something about transport here in South Yorkshire. It's great to hear that you're on board with improving those services. But when was the last time you had to catch a bus?
Last week.
And what do you think of those buses? You know, how can you as mayor enact change? Because actually, I don't think it's just about money. You know, we can't be surprised that take-up of bus services has dropped. You know, a lot of them are filthy. Some of them are slow. Others exhibit antisocial behaviour. We also have services that are too early. They come too early. One bus company actually uses the excuse that timetables are just estimations. So what are your views then when you board these buses? How often do you go on these buses?
So I'm a frequent bus user, and I completely agree with you that bus services are not okay in South Yorkshire. It's just not good enough. The situation that people have to put up with across our region. I think I'd probably sort of talk about privatisation, frankly. So the reason I think we're in the position that we're in when it comes to public transport in South Yorkshire is because in 1985, 1986, we had a privatisation of our bus network. I was just about young enough to remember that. I don't think you probably were. I remember 2p buses. I think other people around the table will too. Buses as far as the eye could see. The privatisation of the bus network is what's led to the steady and slow decline, and now, frankly, kind of fallen off a cliff of our public transport network. That privatisation means that right now bus companies are in charge of significant parts of our bus network. So in terms of where buses run, when they run, how much they charge, that is all controlled by private sector bus companies since the privatisation of the bus network in the 1980s. Now the franchising assessment process and potentially the franchising and public control of our public transport network is what allows us to take back control of that network and allow us to actually run services in a way which benefits the population of South Yorkshire rather than benefits the bus companies. Now, we're doing everything we can to be able to make that change happen as swiftly as we can, albeit within rules that are set by government. The 2017 Bus Services Act, to be fair to the government, was helpful in this regard, so it helped us to move forward on that process. But quite honestly, the other things that the government have been doing in terms of support for buses have just made our lives harder. So we're doing everything we can in South Yorkshire, not least spending in excess of £80 million per year of South Yorkshire people's money on those services. We are using reserves to pay for those services. We've got a significant team here at the Combined Authority working on those services. We're working on things like real-time data, which we've significantly improved upon. We are absolutely working on the planning of the network so that we're delivering services where people want them. But quite honestly, whilst we work within a broken market, we're never going to be able to deliver the services that you or I or anybody else around this table would expect for our communities. I don't think that's okay. I am sorry to say that this government have just made that harder for us, mostly because they have absolutely underfunded public transport services. We're looking at a 50% cut in the amount of money that we receive. We're looking at, in just my time as mayor, over 25–30% of mileage cut across South Yorkshire because of that funding post-pandemic, which is dropping off a cliff. I don't think that's okay. I would absolutely welcome your and your Conservative colleagues' support in calling on this government to do more for South Yorkshire, because it's the only way we're going to get out of this mess.
Right, we're gonna have to move on because we're run out of time. Just one quickly, please.
Thank you. So what are you going to do in the interim then, before you can get franchising in? Because, you know, how are you going to encourage efficiency in the network, both in terms of the companies running routes that are largely empty and routes themselves? So, for example, the X5 that passes through Kiverton could easily reach into Todwick to serve users there. What are you going to do in the interim? And just quickly, just looking at the bus service overall in South Yorkshire, just to bring it to your attention, we seem to have an unbalanced approach when it comes to areas. Sheffield has services that run every 10 minutes, and Rother Valley are losing services.
I'm sorry, you forgive me. I think you probably need to sort of better understand how the bus network operates in South Yorkshire. I'm happy for my colleagues at the MCA to offer a briefing. Maybe it might be helpful just on the basis that...
I think briefs off because we are...
Let me just very quickly answer that question about
but is the mayor saying that you have no control over buses then? Is that what you're saying? That you can't encourage change then? Because your role is, as mayor is also to encourage change, to meet with these bus companies on behalf of the people you represent and encourage change. But you don't seem to be able to do that, do you? So instead, what you want to do is you want to belittle members of this panel and say we don't understand, rather than fight for change in the area.
I think we're going to have to move on. Can I take the next question from Douglas, and then we're going to have to wrap up?
I'm happy to talk to you afterwards if that's helpful.
Very well. I'll keep it brief. In the light that we can move on, but really just to see if there's anything else that you want to say about sort of the big picture here. We had quite a discussion about the VSEP before and where we could have gone if we'd got that money in. But in the sense of we are where we are, even with franchising, it doesn't bring more money into the system. It's a significant investment. It'd be good if the money was there. What options are there for bringing more money in? Easy, just as I think you just said, that the only way is to press government for it. What if that doesn't happen?
Yeah, so I think you and I would agree that public transport is a public service. So this is not a cost; it's an investment. So I think that would be my starting point, and I think we would probably share that approach. I'm absolutely committed, as I've said repeatedly, to do everything I can to make public transport better in South Yorkshire, albeit, to go back to the earlier point, albeit I have much less power and control over bus networks, public transport in general, than I would like. And that's what we're arguing government need to give us, is that power, that control, that money to be able to do this properly here in South Yorkshire, as the people of South Yorkshire would rightly demand and want. If we can't get money from government, there is certainly an element of this which is largely campaigning, which is about saying, if you aren't going to give us that money, then we are going to campaign hard for it. So that's certainly part of it. I would like to see an ability for South Yorkshire to raise money through a precept for transport. Now, currently that is not the case. Currently, we are not able in South Yorkshire to raise money through a local precept, which allows us to take money and develop a scheme in South Yorkshire where we are investing in the priorities that South Yorkshire have, and we have a democratic mandate for that. That isn't currently in place. I don't think that's okay. I don't think that's the way devolution should work. I think South Yorkshire absolutely needs to lean into fiscal devolution more broadly. That includes things like business rate retention, etc. There's a whole bunch of things we could talk about in that space. But currently there are just there's a huge lack of levers on which I can pull to be able to transform the network in the way that I would want, or indeed in the way which it needs. So there isn't enough that I can do is the honest and short answer to your question, other than campaign for it, fight for it if they don't give it to us, and then fight for other changes which allow us to bring more money into the system so we can do things differently.
Can I say thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to future times when we can interrogate you over your plans in the system. And I also look forward to the day when I'm not just missing the 52, 52A when there are 2 buses, and then I know there's not going to be another one for quite a few minutes after that. That's what well, I know, sort of. I'm in urban Sheffield. Come on.
Chair, can I just make an offer, I suppose? And I say this in all good faith, genuinely. The public transport network in South Yorkshire and the way in which public transport works in this country is really complicated. It is that's why we have experts, right? Because this is a very difficult system to understand. There are loads of quirks to it. There are loads of things that you feel like should work but don't. There are loads of obvious things which you feel like you should be able to do which you can't. If members do want to better understand how the public transport network works, both in South Yorkshire and more broadly, I'm happy to offer up officers' time. He says, again, looking hopefully in Martin's direction, to be able to kind of explain to members how that system works so that you can better offer scrutiny to the work that I do. So I'm really happy to do that, because I think it's absolutely right that we are scrutinised here in this committee, but I do think it requires that level of understanding that I think officers can offer. So I'm happy to offer that.
I think that's important. I think though we only have 4 formal meetings a year, I think it's much that we're going to need many more briefings, etc., as the mayoralty develops and the system of the mayoralty develops.
Absolutely.
And I'd like to thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Right, we'll move on now to the MCA review, and that's Martin again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair. Chair, in the interest of time, I'll keep this brief, and I'm conscious that for some members around the table, this may be the 3rd viewing or conversation. So again, for that reason, I'll keep it brief. Thanks for your time. Prior to it going to the MCA board, when we had a good informal Teams discussion, and then also last week the opportunity to give some highlights. Your final point there, Chair, about your work programme moving forward, I think it's very interesting actually in the context of this report, because in the governance recommendations, they are significantly different to the current governance arrangements, and I think it emphasises the more central importance of audit standards and risk and ONS committees as the 2 statutory committees alongside the MCA board. So I foresee a more significant role for ONS actually, and the direct scrutiny of many more MCA board decisions, because many more of the decisions will go through the MCA board, but in a completely open and transparent way. So happy to talk about any of the governance arrangements. Organisationally, we have been driving through a great deal of change in the last year, on the principle of form follows function. The organisation needs to be, if it's going to be an important economic growth instrument for the region, which it needs to be, because the region's growth and productivity is not what we all aspire for it to be, and therefore there needs to be significantly greater emphasis on economic growth. So we have been trying to streamline process system to find shortest route to market on decision making, on funding decisions, while still being safe and prudent. Also ensuring that we have the necessary skills in the organisation. So we've been busy with that over the last year and made a lot of progress so far, and there will be more ahead. So, Chair, I think in summary, I will leave it there because I'm sure that members will want to ask me questions and we need to leave time for that. So thank you.
Do I have any questions on that? Josh and then Douglas.
Thanks, Chair. Just the new governance model with a cabinet-style leadership, it will obviously inevitably mean more work for the four authority leaders. Will those leaders receive an additional allowance?
There is no plan for that, Chair. Steve, as we review the Constitution and governance.
There's certainly no plans for that.
Thank you. Just in terms of sustainability then, if you have new leaders from one of the authorities, how are we going to ensure that those leaders are able to take up some of those responsibilities if they aren't getting reimbursed for the extra time, especially if they have additional work commitments? I'm just talking about sustainability in the long term.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I suppose one of the things I should have said right at the outset was to thank all of the members around the table for your commitment to this board, this committee. I appreciate the scale of the agenda at times, and that you do and commit this work on top of what you do in your respective councils, and that is a considerable workload, and I understand that firsthand. I think I suppose there are two elements to your question. The first is, how do we ensure that any future leader is well briefed? Well, there will be a support team around leaders. There will be a lead chief exec from one of the local authorities or myself, depending on the portfolio. There will be a lead executive director from the MCA on the particular policy areas. Leaders will be well supported in those roles. As for financial remuneration, that's really not a matter for me or for this report today, Chair. There is no intention at this point in time, nor has it been discussed in any of the meetings that I've had about remuneration. So, thank you, Chair.
One last question.
Yeah, so I'm not arguing for or against reimburse, right? I'm just sort of trying to pick. We know transport is emerging as a top issue in South Yorkshire. We've just been talking about it. Who will take the portfolio of travel and transport?
Principally the Mayor.
Thank you. Can move on to Douglas, please.
Well, thanks. Actually, got two questions. First one was actually about that point. So 4.1, you've listed 8 topic areas, which I guess can be divided up by 4 leaders. I just wondered if there'd been any progress on allocating the portfolios to the 4 leaders. Or if that's still, what stage are we at with that?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. We are progressing with that. We will bring the final confirmation of that to the MCA board in September, which will be the board where the culmination of all of this work will be presented, but we are, as we speak, making progress with that.
Yep, no, that's fine. It was just a point of information there. The other one was slightly more pointed on looking at the composition of the advisory boards that are being set up there, and I've noted that. So looking at page 45, the government guidance says that any new business board members must be appointed through an open process. But then when it comes to the Mayor's Economic Advisory Council, it says appointments to the council will be at the direct invitation of the Mayor. And on the Business Advisory Board, it's saying appointments to the board will also include some openly recruited roles, so therefore indicating there'll be some that definitely won't be openly recruited. What's the thinking there? Is he going against government guidance on openness?
Yeah, no, it is entirely consistent. The reason that the Business Advisory Board is described in that way is that there are already in some of the membership organisations, so Chamber of Commerce, for example, there are appointed people to the Chamber of Commerce. We would, of course, want the Chamber of Commerce to be part of a business advisory board. Therefore, de facto, the person who holds that position will be their representative.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Sinead?
Thank you, Chair. There's all this discussion about all the different changes, and then there's a sentence that says existing statutory audit standards and risk committee and overview and scrutiny committees. Has no thought, or what thought has gone into changes to that? I think in some authorities you would have where you have this cabinet with the 4 representatives. Sorry, am I keeping you awake?
It's not you, it's children.
And whether there might be a scrutiny committee per cabinet member, or indeed whether we want to open up overview and scrutiny and other authorities have co-opted members from outside with some what's what I'm looking for, some expertise in different areas, and whether we ought to actually look at whether overview and scrutiny also ought to be enhanced and changed and supported in the same way that is being proposed for those other parts.
Chair, if I may. You may be aware there's a new accountability framework for organisations with devolved functions being developed by government at the moment. Part of that is to introduce a new scrutiny protocol, which will be then recommended to us all or mandated to us all to follow. So that's coming out hopefully later this year. So that will shape sort of how scrutiny goes forward in the future for MCAs and other bodies with devolved functions. And equally, there's nothing to stop recommendations going to the MCA. In terms of what you're saying, part of it is time, members' meetings. Is it better scrutinised in one place or split? So there's discussions to be had. It's not a closed. The reference to saying the existing overview and scrutiny remain was merely to point out the fact that they're still statutory committees. We're not changing. There's no change to that. We still need to have you and the audit committee and the value you bring to the organisation.
Could I suggest that again is something when we're talking about the work programme that we have a discussion about as well?
I think we must, and I think we need to have a timescale on you towards the end of the year, so we need to know which meeting is going to be factored into and whether we that sort of thing.
Yeah, Chair, thanks. The year ahead, of course, is going to be a settling in, bedding down year, and I think as we progress through that, we'll have a better sense of workload demands, the framework that Steve has just mentioned, which is referenced in the report. So would welcome that engagement with you as we move forward.
Thank you for that. Any further questions? Because then we can move on. Sorry, sorry.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I say sorry. Right, and we'll move on and finally, next Gareth. You've been waiting for some time, I know.
Thank you, Chair. Just by way of introduction, my name is Gareth Sutton. I'm the Exec Director for Resources and Investment. I'm the Chief Financial Officer, but I also look after our investment portfolio. So I'm not sure if everyone was here when I last spoke to the board about the renewal fund back in January. So if I've got a couple of presentations that I just pass these around.
Hope it's up to date. No, I'm 5 Water Road. Oh, I'm okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So within the pack that I've just given you is a presentation that I provided to the committee back in January, and right at the back is also a list of all the investments that we've made so far from our gain share funding. Gain share funding relates to the funding that we receive from government as part of our devolution deal. So just by way of reference, as part of the devolution deal, we acquired quite a lot of powers, which is great, but also a long-term funding settlement, £900 million over 30 years. First money arrived in 2020, so that will run to 2050. So £30 million a year, £80 million capital, £12 million worth of revenue. So I'll just give you a quick tour around what is in that presentation, just so I can land what we've got on the agenda today. So the renewal fund is really important. It's a fund of funds, but it's largely predicated on the gain share money, this devolution money that we've got. And when I talked last time, I mentioned 3 reasons why this fund is really important. The first is that it's committed over the long term. So just like a local authority, very little of our money is going to be there in 5 years' time. So government works to funding cycles, spending reviews and so on. And that means that the funding settlements that we get tend to be relatively short term. So we don't have a stable long-term funding stream. And that is a problem if you want to do something big, like grow an economy or change the economic fortunes of an entire region. You need long-term sustainability, and this funding gives us that. So it's really important to us. The second point is that it's very flexible. So we just talked earlier when we were talking about buses, about the fact that some funding that we have comes with lots of conditions. We have rules on what you can use that funding for and what you can't use it for, whether you need a ministerial agreement if you want to change what you do with that funding mid-flow and so on. This funding is largely given to us with very light details on what we can do. So as long as we're staying within legislation, as long as we're acting legally, it's largely up to us. So that's the principle of devolution. So a long-term funding commitment with lots of flexibility about what we do with it. So that's really important to us. And the third point was that we got powers, we got funding, but we also got the opportunity to apply for borrowing powers. And that matters because a 30-year funding commitment gives us that long-term security over the funding, but also exposes us to inflation. So in 30 years' time, £30 million will be worth a lot less. But because government gives us borrowing powers, it offers us the opportunity to reshape the cash flows. So we could borrow against that long-term cash flow, put investment into South Yorkshire now, get the benefits of that investment now, and then repay it in the longer term. So there's a balance within this, because obviously you have to pay interest costs on that. But whatsoever inflation is higher than interest costs, it makes sense to borrow. So gain share offers us lots of opportunities that we've not had in the past. It also affords us then an opportunity to think much long term. So if we're not constrained in our thinking by a very short term funding settlement with lots of rules, we've got this opportunity right now to stand back and say, okay, if we want to reshape South Yorkshire's economy, how do we do it? And we decided that the best way to do that was to develop 5 investment plans, one for each local authority that we call the place plan, so a plan for each place, and then one wraparound regional growth plan that we call the prospectus for growth. And those plans would set out the ambition for South Yorkshire. And we recognised that if we wanted to stimulate that ambition, after a decade of austerity when a lot of people have hunkered down and ambition has been curtailed and we've been thinking about how we get through to the end of the year rather than much longer term, we need to put some money into the system. So we set aside some of our revenue funding from gain share in the last 2 years to what we call the Project Feasibility Fund. And that money is there to stimulate ideas and to develop ideas into investable opportunities. And we also expected some of that money to be used to shape these plans. And that kind of brings us up to where we are now. So we asked each local authority to develop their place plan, and we agreed that the region would work on its prospectus for growth. And on the 5th of June, the MCA board received a place plan from Barnsley and Doncaster and Rotherham. Those place plans are in the pack today, and they present the opportunities for us to anchor the MCA into local priorities and local investment plans. Now, this is quite exciting for me because these set out long-term investment plans for each of the local areas, and gives us that
Can I
opportunity.
just interrupt you for a second, because I know you mentioned 3 authorities and it was the 5th of June. It's was it just a week late, or is it still not been received from the 4th authority within?
So yeah, Sheffield is still developing their plan now, which is fine for us. Yeah. So
I don't know whether they had it in their sense.
when we set out timelines for this, we agreed that place plans will be delivered by March 2024. So Barnsley, Doncaster and Rotherham have managed to pull these forward much quicker. Sheffield's doing a lot of work at the moment around its city goals, and that will be the driver for their place plan. So the timing is okay for us. So this offers us now a real opportunity, because for the first time we've got individual plans for 3 of our authorities, and that sets out their long-term ambition, and it sets out individual projects and how those projects speak to MCA priorities. Those priorities are set out in our strategic economic plan, focused on 3 core themes: a stronger economy, a fairer inclusive economy, and a greener economy. So the plans are in the pack that hopefully you've had a chance to look at. Each authority has approached this in a slightly different way, which is fine. They're local plans, but each of them speaks back to those 3 core outcomes for the MCA: stronger, greener, fairer. So there's a lot of work that's now underway to work out how we bring these plans to life. What we don't want is another strategy that sits on a shelf. So we'll be working with local authority partners, and we're already on with that. My programme management office is working hand in glove with lots of local authority teams right now to start to bring projects forward. And as we bring those projects forward, there's a number of questions that we'll be asking. So what does a good scheme look like? Right now, we've got things on a piece of paper, often no more than a line or a couple of paragraphs. But we've got this money in our project feasibility fund to really develop those schemes out. So we want really thoughtful, thought-through schemes that will speak to how we deliver for South Yorkshire. It's really important as well that we think about how we fund and finance these schemes. So we've had decades now of being a grant-giving authority, and it's a quick way to spend money, but it's not always the most efficient. So we'll be working with our partners and local authorities, but also some of our institutional investment partners. And I spoke to some of you last week about the project that we're working on with the South Yorkshire Pension Fund, and I referenced some of the work that we're doing with institutional investors. And that gives us the opportunity to think how we would finance these more efficiently into the future. So I'll leave it there, but I think this is a really exciting opportunity for the MCA.
Thank you very much. Do I have any questions at the moment? Say, Douglas.
Yeah, just one thing. Looking at the table on the 3rd page, on the housing and infrastructure side, that seems conspicuous by the relatively small amount of investment going into it. I think it refers to the Brownfield Housing Fund, which is a good initiative. And I just wondered, was proposals to sort of put more into that? And I was thinking about the scale of housing right across South Yorkshire, where it really ties into a lot of the retrofitting and jobs agendas, and developing South Yorkshire as it's got huge potential for developing a whole load of technology and business to apply to achieving net zero on homes right across the region there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I guess a couple of things. Housing is also incredibly important for health inequality issues that we all know about, damp houses being a problem. We're doing a lot of work at the moment around things like retrofit, so how we improve existing housing stock, and we've got a number of irons in the fire on that. Doncaster's running a pilot scheme at the moment. We're funding a pilot scheme through the Project Feasibility Fund again. We're also supporting work through the South Yorkshire Sustainability Centre, and we're also speaking to a lot of the institutional investors as well. So South Yorkshire Pension Fund is really interested in how they can support affordable housing within the region, and institutional investors really excited in this space.
Can I ask supplementary to about you talking about the retrofitting, and it's a pilot in Doncaster. Are you going to be sharing that knowledge? Because this is one of the things about councils working in silos, and even a possibility with this mayoral authority that you have something you're doing well, but it's not being shared with the other authorities. So I know, because that's what we need to move forward fast on. And so if the pilot is working out and working through, and it's looking like it's sharing that knowledge, and how are you planning to do that?
See, no one's cracked retrofit nationally at the moment, as you're probably all aware. So it's really incumbent upon us to share good practice and also share things that haven't worked as well, so that we don't all spend public money on similar schemes. Against every scheme, we commit to monitoring and evaluation, which is an independent assessment of what has worked and what has worked well, and that's a really good opportunity for us to share that around with regional partners. But we also have the sort of officer groups that you'd expect, where we are sharing knowledge, and we're tracking that scheme in Doncaster in particular as we progress.
Douglas, you got another
Yeah,
question?
actually, no, that's fine. I'll perhaps come back in a moment.
Because I think that's and we'll thank you for that, Gareth. They're very informative, and I hope we'll get regular chances to talk to you about all this that's going on.
That's great.
Thank you very much for your time. And now we're moving on to the next item on the agenda, and that's Tom. Tom's come in. Oh, sorry, I dropped that. That's an old one. Yeah, sorry, wrong one. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try and be quite quick based on the time, but do ask me any questions you want to as we get to the end. So just very quickly to say, the spring budget in 23, the Chancellor announced that 8 MCA areas and their constituent local authorities have been invited to co-design investment zone proposals with government. And broadly, this is a programme that aims to grow high potential innovation and industrial strengths in different areas. Okay, if successful, you receive a fiscal envelope of £80 million over 5 years. That's divided 60% capital, 40% revenue, and it can be used flexibly between spending and tax incentives. There's a clear expectation that any future proposal put forward builds on our existing strategies and evidence, and as such we've been using the work that's been underpinned the Advanced Manufacturing Innovation District proposals to give the evidence base for our proposal into government. There's 3 key components to this, which is identifying a lead sector for the region, identifying a geography and spatial core, and identifying key sites that can support growth in the lead sector, any associated clusters, and the region more broadly. So to give an update around those areas, we have been working with DLUC, which is Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, and we've been looking at how we define our lead sector. We've proposed that advanced manufacturing will be our lead sector, but we'll define that in a very expansive way. And broadly, with the pitch we are making is that it's about regional know-how to manufacture technical solutions to difficult problems. This allows us to lean into lots of different growth areas and subsectors that includes clean energy, sustainable mobility, flight defence, life sciences, digital and medtech. Geographical focus, our proposed spatial core EIZ will span across Rotherham Town Centre and Sheffield City Centre, but it will also include our 4 innovation campuses and 2 city centre growth areas. In addition to that, we're identifying opportunity sites in both Barnsley and Doncaster, where we will look to solve the challenge of making our manufacturing base more sticky. So where we have research in our spatial core, we'll look to crowd in the work and jobs that come with that into our different spaces. So over the coming weeks, we're going to be working with officials on this to refine the nature of our geography, refine what key interventions will be in place, and we'll look to see how our 80 million of flexible spend is used. It's probably fair to say that the timeline for this is incredibly challenging. We've been working really quickly with officers from all of our constituent local authorities and our research institutes. We're meeting them twice weekly, and we're moving through this relatively quickly. The final proposal will be ratified at the MCA board, but I'll leave there and I can take any questions that you might have.
Do we have any questions for anybody on the table? No. That was easy. Thank you very much for your time. I think that's the last final item on the agenda, isn't it? Thank you. Thank you very much for your time, everybody, today. Thank you to the officers for their reports, and we've got a few tasks to carry on with after this. Thank you very much.